Testing, 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 testing. That was a lot louder than I thought. Okay. Hello. Hello, my little fireflies and fairies and all that good stuff. Welcome back to another reading of Straight On Till Morning, a twisted Disney tale of Peter Pan. What if Wendy first went to Neverland with Captain Hook? If you remember from the last couple of chapters, if you remember from the last chapter, I'm sorry, Wendy finally made it to Neverland with Captain Hook. However, she was not very specific with her request, and she made a deal with Captain Hook that she would give Peter Pan's shadow to him if Captain Hook took her to Neverland, which he did hold up his end of the bargain. He took her to Neverland, but he is not letting her off of the Jolly Roger. That was the thing. She said to take her to Neverland, but she never mentioned anything about getting off of the ship. And Captain Hook's not gonna let her. So let's get right on into it. This is chapter 7, Tink Among the Salarymen. The way to London was not unknown to fairies. It was just rarely used anymore. Smog was bad for wings, and the nude machines made for strange dreams in children. Fewer and fewer were of the sunny meadows and hidden vales that once captured their imagination. When Tink appeared in the sky above, it was as if a shy star had worked up the courage to appear among its brighter cousins. She glimmered golden and faint at first, and then brighter and nearer, but never any larger. The sound she made as she descended, however, was not the music of the spheres or anything so celestial. It fell somewhere between angry hornet and angry percussionist shaking a rack of bells for the worst ever Christmas concert. Below her, all of London was grey and rolling and endless and eternally the same. If she squinted, the little fairy could almost pretend that, instead of houses, the streets were lined with the hives of mirror rabbits. Maybe from the wrong side of the savannah, but friendly nevertheless. The thing was, Tinkerbell never actually paid attention when Peter took her to these jaunts. She loved hearing about Peter's babyhood. She loved revisiting his lost home. But she hated going to ugly Wendy's house. She had no idea how Peter had even found the girl and her stupid, snotty little brothers. Somehow, the stories that Wendy told of his exploits ad nauseum had reached his pixie ears in a way that just quizzicantly Panish. It was near Kensington Gardens, wasn't it? She flew the way she vaguely remembered they used to go, following the themes and keeping an eye out for pockets of green among the gray, brown, and black. Aha! At last, something familiar. She recognized the updraft that had suddenly lifted her so high into the sky it made it difficult for someone as light as she to land anywhere. Peter never had any trouble. Once in a great while, she clung to his collar while he dove through gusts, and these were the best moments of all. The sky was just beginning to lighten as Tinkerbell touched down delicately inside a park. She felt some fairy familiarity. Magic had not entirely deserted this ancient place, but these fae folk were of earthly origin, and she had no time for such riffraff. She was Neverland inferior, and she had work to do. As she peeped around the garden gate and up the street, she realized that things looked very different when you were down among the ugly buildings and not high above them. At least it was early, and she had the city mostly to herself while she explored. There were only a few humans around this time of the morning. A solitary girl hurried along, looking over her shoulder every few steps. She was large and ugly. Was it Wendy? Tinkerbell approached her eagerly, but no. Up close it was obvious the girl's dress was shabby and poor, and her eyes darted about in fear. They didn't hold steady in dreams. Toward this not Wendy girl, a pair of men strode boldly. Their voices were loud and their dress obviously fine, even to a forest pixie eyes. Great silk and wool capes, shiny top hats, slightly askew, walking canes with glittering knobs. Much like foxes and wolves, they had obviously been out all night hunting for whatever rare-filled things these humans craved. Glasses, taxes, cream puffs. Egags, is that the dance of old Moulin Vogue, the one you like so much? One of the men said, golfing, pointing at the human girl. Good evening, sis, she said, pulling her collar close and trying to hurry past them. The other man put his hand and stopped her, then looked her up and down. No, she's a copy. Still. Please, sis, let me go. I'm just on my way home. From what nefarious activities, I should like to know, the first man said with a snort. Would anyone even miss you? At home? All the decent girls have been in bed and asleep for hours. They're not out wandering the streets at night looking for trouble. I ain't looking for trouble. Just let me go, she pleaded. Tinkerbell's eyes widened as she watched the men reach out to touch the girl's cheek. Before she knew what she was doing, the little fairy was suddenly zooming in between the two, pelting pixie dust into the man's eyes. The reaction was immediate. He howled and clawed at his face like a madman. His friend drew back in surprise. The girl saw her chance and ran off, mouthing silent thanks to her mysterious savior. The ball of light, now zooming away, brightened visibly, thanks to a new believer in fairy magic. I can see, the man moaned, falling to his knees. I see too much. The world, as it is, the great god Pan. But Tink was already whisking down the street, that adventure over and forgotten. There were plentiful of helpful street signs in this London, if only she could read. She remembered a big tree at the house. That's how Peter always found it. A big tree in a tiny yard with an unused doghouse below. The windows to the nursery were on level with the highest branches of that tree, so they could perch there and listen. If Peter was especially enamored of the story, they would glide silently over the roof and lie on the slate shingles, half listening, half dreaming. Some of the street signs were indeed large, grand, and imposing, and sadly penned in, surrounding by cobbles and flagstones. None were in the yard. Human movement increased as the sun rose. Lamps were doused and people came out. They were sweeping the streets, hurrying into shops, unlocking doors with big keys. Tinkerbell buzzed unseen over everyone's heads, looking out for young women of a certain height. Aha! There! A young woman in a very familiar blue dress entered a bookstore and coughed to get the bookseller's attention. How perfectly Wendy! Tinkerbell zoomed down to see if she was indeed her. This girl definitely seemed more likely than the first one. All right, her skin looked darker, and her hair too, but who could tell? Humans were strange. Maybe they changed now and then. I have a question about a book. Please. The girl spoke softly. No, that was definitely not Ugly Wendy. Ugly Wendy wasn't shy when she spoke. She was loud, and to the fairy's ears, strident and pushy. My wares are far more refined and intellectual than what will satisfy the likes of you. The shop, the shop owner snapped without looking up from his own book. I doubt you could even read. Where are you from? My parents are from Barbados, sir. I was born in England, and I am a citizen. Hardly. Leave my premises at once. But get out now, or I shall summon the constable. Your kind is not welcome here. The girl sighed, shook her head, and left. Tinkerbell also buzzed off, confused and full of unquiet thoughts. She paused to catch her breath and sort things out, and also to suggest a couple of nearby mice that they would probably very much enjoy comfy nests made exclusively out of a shop's worth of shredded books. They agreed and scampered off, summoning dozens of their friends. Wendy was a big, ugly girl. That was just the truth of the matter, and she took Peter's attention away from Tink, despite being big and ugly. But was this the world she lived in, where random men might try to hurt her? Where even if a girl was polite, people ignored her, yelled at her, made fun of her? Was this why ugly Wendy stayed inside all the time, telling stories to her brothers? Because it was safe? Because she could be whatever she wanted? Maybe her brothers were also ugly, but at least they treated her with respect. Tinkerbell shook her head, trying to physically beat the thoughts out. They were complicated and negative, and felt strangely familiar to the ones she had about Peter and convincing him that his shadow wasn't in London. There was something icky about them, like the bad smelling guglimud that you could never completely get off. You always thought you had, but there would be just a tiny bit somewhere, and you wouldn't be able to find it, and you would stink embarrassingly for days. She rose into the air to fly her mind clean. She skimmed along the roofs and chimneys and spires of London, spiraling out wider and wider, expanding her search. Sometime mid-morning, when the tired sun crawled into his work clothes of smoke and mist, Tinkerbell finally found the attic apple she remembered from years before. But unlike every other time she and Peter had come to hear stories, the windows were shut and fastened tight. Tinkerbell frowned and whizzed back and forth. She rapped on the glass angrily with her tiny knuckles. No one was there. She zoomed into the garden and up the kitchen door and knocked, trying to stick her head into the too small keyhole. She jingled furiously when she got stuck there for a moment. Then she heard a scratching on the other side, almost like a response to her knocks. She redoubled her efforts, slamming against the wood feet first. The door suddenly pulled The door pulled slowly and laboriously inward, and she tumbled into the darling household. There were no humans about, only the dog was there. She regarded the fairy with large, woeful eyes, but the little fairy didn't stop to say hello or thank you. She zoomed like an angry hornet from room to room until she found the stairs and zipped up them, and then a second set of stairs, when she realized her destination lay on the next floor. A low thudding of steps, Nana came up slowly behind her, as well as a doggy sigh or two. Here was the terrible room where ugly Wendy told her stories to her brothers, while Tink and Peter stayed outside, looking, listening in. With all of its stupid, ugly, large human tools and bits and pieces littering the room, though it seemed there was far less clutter than the last time. She flew chaotically back and forth, over lamps and trunks, into the wardrobe and amongst the clothes, causing dust of both the general and pixie variety to spray about indiscriminately. Woof! Nana had finally made it to the top of the stairs and sat down on her haunches with resignation, knowing it would do little good to physically stop the fairy. Tinkerbell stopped her buzzing around and hovered in front of the dog, angrily jingling questions. Woof! Nana said, rolling her eyes towards the burrow. Tinkerbell flew into the half-open top drawer so hard she bumped against the back. She might have gotten trapped inside had Nana not put up a massive paw to stop the drawer from closing. The fairy looked around frantically, lighting up every corner with her glow. But all of the shadows behaved normally, twisting and struggling and shrinking and growing with her movements. None were Peter's. She flew out and glared at the dog. Nana didn't respond, hearing something with her giant dog ears that even the pixie couldn't at first. Something horrible was waking, bones clicking into place as it stretched its feeble limbs, and realized it was all alone. Yip! Yippity yip! Yippity yip yip! Tinkerbell froze. Another dog? Where were the humans? Where were Wendy and her two brothers? What was going on here? She hadn't realized how much she had experienced things to be exactly the same as before. She had expected things. 3 children in the nursery, Nana pottering about, furniture and toys askew. Everything had changed subtly and strangely, like a spring after a bad winter, when plants came up where they hadn't before. Fear began to snuck through her anger. She jingled tentatively. In answer, Nana just jerked her head towards the window. Peter's shadow and Wendy were somewhere behind the clouds, beyond London. Tinkerbell jingled a hesitant question. Woof. Tink's facility with dog speak wasn't perfect, so there was no way to be certain that Nana had said everything at all about pirates, right? Without a second thought, Tinkerbell took off as fast as she could, out of the house and into the clouds. Oh, okay, so that was chapter 7. Tinkerbell finally made her way out to London to try to find Wendy and Peter Pan's shadow. I don't think necessarily find Wendy, but to find Peter Pan's shadow for sure. Um, yeah, I guess I don't know. I don't know how I feel about Tinkerbell being able to understand dog speak because she's a tinker fairy, not an animal fairy. Mm, I don't know. But she did say her speech wasn't all that good, so I don't know. She may have picked it up from talking with Nana so much. But this is Chapter 8, Interlude, A Dog's View. Some readers might, well, be curious. Was Nana upset at being left home from all these adventures? School, Neverland, doing things with pirates and pixies? No, she was a dog, with dog dreams. Few things made her happier than the stories in her own head when she was hunkered down in front of a warm fire with a full belly. She would have appreciated some gratitude, however, for time well served. Perhaps a nice juicy steak on her birthday and Christmas, and maybe the occasional Tuesday as a welcome surprise. That's so that was pretty much. I'm actually not gonna count that as chapter 8. Here we go. This is chapter 8. Unexpected help. I will not. Wendy sat with her arms crossed and legs primarily together. Before her was a washtub full of hot salt water, suds, pirate clothes, and stink. A half dozen half-naked pirates glowered around her, arms also crossed, though some were holding knives in their fists. But you're the mother of the ship now, one said, screaming Byron, whose jacket she had patched. It was the only It was only the second or third day she had already learned most of their names. The washing's your responsibility. Absolutely not, Wendy snapped, glaring at him so violently he almost fell backward. I already take issue with the whole idea of being your mother, but being your scullery maid is entirely out of the question. Go find someone else to do your dirty work. My mother's beautiful hands never scrubbed a nasty pair of pirate unmentionables, and neither shall mine. The men looked at each other in surprise. Apparently, this was an idea new to them. Mothers always did the wash, didn't they? But perhaps they hadn't much experience with the type. One leaned forward with his long knife and actually growled. Oh, cut me off, will you, Ziggy? Oh, cut me off, will you, Ziggy? Wendy said, rolling her eyes. That's proper behavior towards a mother. Let's ignore the fact that not a single one of you has presented me with a posy, or a badly done but affectionate drawing, or a pretty shell you found, or even a... She had been about to say kiss, but thought better of it at the last moment. Even the tiniest token of your appreciation. And after I sang you all that lullaby last night. The pirates looked, if not exactly challenged. I don't know how to say that word. Then at least a little thoughtful. We're new at this. The one with green teeth said, to each your own, Newton. I never heard a mother before. Don't know the rules. Another, Jareth, cleared his throat. Well, if you're not gonna do the wash, then just set a nice table tonight then, with folded napkins, maybe? We'll see, Wendy said levelly. The pirate scuffled off, muttering and chastised. Wendy collapsed. It had taken all of her will to remain indignant and cold. The knives were actually absolutely terrifying, and the pirate's behavior was violent and insane. And here I am, negotiating with them, she said with a disgusted sigh, kicking the washtub. They've made me their slave, and I'm telling them I won't do the very worst of the work. She sighed and picked up the finished clean clothes, folding them. These she dropped into a basket, trying to remember which thing belonged to which pirate so she could place each on the proper hammock, and they wouldn't just tear into the pile, throwing things all over the place as was their usual custom. What a mess. She had to escape her boring dismissal life in London, only to enter an even more dismissal one in Neverland. Where were the wishes? Where were the palm trees? Where were the adventures on savage shores? What to do? She could see one terrible possible future, one in which she remained with the pirates and became a little hard like them, praising some and cas- castigating us, I think, others, wrapping them all around her finger until they did her bidding like good little boys, maybe even to the point of rebelling against their father, Hook. That was a disgusting thought. Mm-mm. Ooh, don't you ever put that thought in my head again. No. There was, of course, a far more immediate and pressing concern than her eventual career about the Jolly Roger, the fate of Neverland itself. Hook had definitely implied its and Peter's destruction at his hand. Somehow she didn't believe that rather permanent meant the decision of never docking on his shores again. Despite some sly questioning of the newly friendly crew, Wendy received no answers about Hook's plans. The pirates didn't know, nor did they care. They were sick of Neverland and eager to get on with their pirateering and on other seas. That was all they cared about. Which, of course, begged the question, what other seas? She never really thought about the rest of this world, beyond the island where Peter and the Lost Boys lived. And somehow her handling of Peter's shadow to Hook helped him with his plot. She had to escape, to find help, to find Peter Pan. There was nothing else for it. But how? As she carried the basket of clothes towards the hatch that led below decks to the crew's quarters, Hook swooshed by her, all ruffles and coat and double cigars in their fancy golden holder. How goes it this morning with you, mother? He asked, a sly smile on his face. Wendy felt a twist of violence in her stomach. It had been bad enough when John and Michael joked about how rarely they saw their own mother and how Wendy had taken her place. It was, of course, worse when these murderous hooligans called her mother. But there was something especially nasty about Hook's use of the word. The way a quarrelsome old husband might say it to his old wife. Not that there was anything untoward about it. The captain wasn't at all suggesting anything inappropriate in their relationship. It was just wrong. Completely utterly wrong. It's just it's just nasty. Ew. This morning the crew this morning is going absolutely terrible, Captain Hook. I will organize, fold, and mend the crew's clean clothes, but I will not do the washing. I have my limits, she said firmly. Oh, whatever. We can have all that done ashore if we must, he said, rolling his eyes as if she were silly for even mentioning it. And how are you doing this morning? Wendy asked coldly. Or shall I ask, what are you doing? Just the usual captaincy, piratey things, he said, whirling his hand in the air, trying to figure out the proper route to take with a little spectral help. And then we shall set sail. Wendy didn't like the sound of that at all. A little spectral help? Do you mean Peter Pan's shadow? What are you doing with it? Miss Darling. He leaned forward and grinned eerily into her face. If you were so worried about his fate, perhaps you shouldn't have traded away in a deal with the devil. And with that, he spun and strode off, obviously pleased with his answer. Wendy felt what remaining energy she had drain out through her feet, slide along the planks, and spill overboard. She sank to the deck, resting her head on a pile of clean clothes, and began to weep. What had she done? She knew it was wrong. She knew it. No good would ever come of trading Pan's shadow. Any arrangement made with Hook and his pirates could never end happily. She had known that in her heart, and still she had done it, desperate to escape Neverland. And now it seemed all of Neverland was going to pay for her rash decision. Pirate's love got you down, love. Wendy looked up, wiping her eyes. Standing there in a sway-backed, repugnantly self-assured slouch was Zane. I thought I was coming here to have adventures, she said disgustingly, wiping her tears. Not to be a slave to pirates for the rest of my life while Neverland is utterly destroyed. I have to get out of here. Ah, so many of us look for adventure and wind up as slaves one way or another, the pirate said philosophically. When you're young, you think the world will make room for who you are and what you want. And then you find the world of adults is even more limiting than the world of children, with no room for adventure, much less your own thoughts. Wendy regarded the pirate curiously. This was the most thoughtful, intelligent thing she had heard on the ship so far. He laughed quietly at the look on her face. I'll get you out, he promised. Really? Wendy asked, surprised out of her usual politeness. But why? Because some of us actually have to escape, to hide in plain sight, to fight with the world to get the adventure we deserve. Ye think a pirate would be the freest person in the world, wouldn't ye? But even here, there are other people's rules to follow, and men don't like what's different. At least not at first, now do they? No, I suppose not, Wendy said thoughtfully. She wasn't entirely sure what he was driving at. Maybe he didn't want to be a pirate? Maybe he wanted to be something else altogether. What if she and the boys, just by imagining it, had cast him in the role of buccaneer forever? What if he wanted to be a shepherd, or even a banker? Oh, excuse me. The poignancy of his words struck her heart. Mm, excuse me. I had to take a little break there. I'm not but trapped in the pot I play, and maybe it's because of that, but I can't stand to see others what are constrained against their will too. And maybe it'll be a good deed what goes against my own lenity for skullduggery. I did not follow nomination. The pirates, the pirates involved in that shadow nonsense, and the crew is getting restless. The captain's involved in that shadow nonsense, and the crew's getting restless. He's promised us soon back to our villainous ways, so when the tide turns on them all, we'll be off. Or there'll be mutiny, mark my words. I'll have to get out tonight, just before dawn. I can't swim, Wendy said, looking doubtfully at the water below. At least not very well. There's a one-man dinghy for repairs and whatnot. I'll toss it over the side, but you have to slide down the rope to it. I don't think I could spare more than one paddle without raising suspicion. If you care enough about your freedom, you'll figure out how to use it right. I feel like that's some sort of metaphor you could apply to your own life, sir. The pirate laughed again. Not at all like a villain. Just make sure you're up before the Southern Cross fades from view, and meet me stormside. Not that I'm not greatly appreciative of all this, Wendy said politely. But what is to keep Hook from turning around to look at me? Even if I manage to figure out how to row with one paddle, I dare say it's unlikely I could be on the beach outrunning a crew of angry pirates, afraid of their mother. Zane gave a thin smile. Oh, don't you worry about that, love. I'll just say, what's that? Anyone hear the tickings of the clock? And Hook will have us speeding out of here like that old dead croc is in his pants. Well, he'll say it's the croc between me and you. I think it's just the sound of time passing that puts the fear of the devil into him. I think he knows somewhere in that musky head of his old companion is long gone. Anyway, our beloved captain is mostly engaged in other pursuits. You're a pretty thing, and useful, but a thin detail in the calamitous fable of our captain's life. He's after bigger prey. Bigger prey? Made it obvious. He's using the shadow to somehow find and get Peter Pan. Thought we were done with that nonsense years ago, Zane said, sighing. But what about his first mate, Mr. Smee? It sounds like he's very loyal to Captain Hook. Won't he see through your ruse and try to persuade Hook to chase me? At this, the pirate just laughed and kept laughing, wandering away and slapping his knee. It wasn't pleasant laughter, and despite the rescue she was being offered, it left Wendy uneasy. To stay up, she tried a trick she read about in a book. She drank several pints of tar-scented water just before bedtime. This was hard to keep from the pirates, who drank nothing before bed besides their grog ration and whatever flask they had hidden. The crew had made her a private bedroom below decks, among the ship's stores, and to their credit they hung there a very nice hammock, and covered it with whatever they had that passed for cushions. Hook even contributed a tiny French velvet pillow that looked more like a jellyfish than something fit for bed. Wendy contemplated it now, wondering what hapless ship or manor it had been looted from. She drifted off, almost pleasantly, in the gentle rocking hammock. It didn't seem like any time had passed at all when our eyes snapped open to utter darkness. The terrible, disgusting noises of a ship full of sleeping pirates came from the berths below above her, snoring, tossing, turning, talking or whining in their sleep, as well as far other unimaginable noises. Wendy tipped out of her hammock as quietly as she could, wincing at the creaks from the newly knotted ropes. Then she strapped on her leather satchel, now full of strained bits and bulbs and pirate treasure, and climbed the ladder. The pirate noses reached a crescendo as she pulled herself up onto the gun deck right behind their quarters. Her mind whirled through the possible scenarios of being caught. She expected a hand to clamp down on her shoulder at any moment, her flight discovered. Although she tiptoed, it was probably unnecessary. The ship rattled and groaned like a haunted mansion as it rode the little nighttime waves. The planks she walked didn't squeak at all. Shaking and trembling, she finally made it out to the main deck, where a great gulp of fresh air and an upside-down bowl of stars were a welcome relief. She studied the sky and finally managed to locate the Southern Cross, which was already fading in the false dawn. Funny, that Neverland skies should be so familiar to the real world's, Wendy thought. Not London's skies, of course, for rare was the night that one could see stars through the fog. And that particular constellation was of course absent from northern heavens. The Mizenmes rose like a great centaur. She cast a weary eye up to the crow's nest, but it was empty. Perhaps the most dreadful pirates of the seas on the seas of Neverland didn't need to post a lookout for Royal Navy ships or potential foes. Still, the cockiness, or laziness, of it irked her sense of propriety. I need to just. She edged up to the rail and looked down. Directly below her was the balcony that hung off the captain's quarters. While it wouldn't have surprised her at all to see the nearly inhuman Captain Hook awake and smoking his infernal cigars, pondering what insanity it was that kept him going, the balcony was pleasantly empty. Far below that was the Black Sea, little white tips of its baby waves playing in the starlight. "Quietly done, young miss," came a voice from behind her. She spun around. It was just Zane, but now he was shaking his head. "That is, I was impressed with your sneaking, until it were obvious you had no idea why I was here. You'll never survive Neverland if you're not on your guard." "Survive Neverland?" Wendy whispered indignantly. "It's a place of fantasy and imagination. I lived Neverland growing up. It is mine as much as yours." "And how well do you know yourself then, I wonder?" the pirate said softly. "Anyhow, look." He pulled a black tarp that was laying on the deck, unnoticed amongst the dregs and bits aboard a pirate vessel. A very tiny dinghy was revealed. It was more like the coracles children played with at the seaside than a proper boat. Wendy sucked in her breath, but didn't say anything. The pirate picked up the boat and gave it a surprising throw. It arched out almost like a fishing line before dropping to the water with a very minute splash. It could have been a very large fish leaping from the water. Angelic blue I can't read words. Phosphorus dazzled for a moment in a ring around the boat before fading. Down you go, lassie, Zane said, pointing to another rope tied to the railing. Wendy looked at the old, frayed-looking rope and the sea far below. But she was an English girl. She squared her shoulders, took a deep breath, and saluted the pirate. I thank you, sir. I shall endeavour to repay your kindness some day. Nobody salutes on a pirate ship, he said with disgust. We're all equals here, except for the captain. More than anywhere else in the world, I might add. Guess you think about that some, missy. Off you go, then. He hoisted her up over the railing, making sure her hands were tight around the rope. Then he let go. Aside from antics in the nursery and some games when she had gone to school, Wendy's physical activity had been limited to bracing constitutionals around the park. Fast walks, in other words. Bearing a few morning stretches, her arm strength was delimited by chores. She was terrified, but she closed her eyes, wrapped her feet around the rope, and slid. What it must have looked like from a distance. A tiny pale girl slipping down a thin rope from a galleon that floated silently in the midnight sea. Her light blue dress ballooned around her like a paper lantern lit from underneath. Yet it was not without certain amount of grace that she had made her way to the icy waters below. Zane had fished a dinghy so close to the ship as possible, so only half of Wendy's skirts got wet, as she awkwardly transferred to the tiny boat. The equally tiny paddle was hooked in just under the hull, as neat as a child's playset. She waved once to the figure on the ship high above her. Whether he waved back or was even still there at all was impossible to tell against the blackness of the sky. Wendy gritted her teeth, settled herself on her knees, and began to row. This was the point where, if she were telling the story to Michael and John, she would say something like this. And so the hero struggled, arms growing weak, a glittery sheen of cold perspiration covering her brow. She felt faint. In the east, rosy-fingered dawn was just the brushing sky, but all else was black. The black vault of heavens above her, the black sea around her, the black distant shore, the thousand slimy things that lived in the murky waters below and occasionally brushed the boat with their black fins. Countless hours passed. It was all she could do to keep her eyes fixed on the shore and her strength at the paddle. The terror of being captured and the need to escape drove her through the harrowing gauntlet of exhaustion and fear. Wearily or triumphantly, she passed through to the other side. Though the task seemed endless and nevertheless, she persisted. But the real Wendy was growing weak and utterly fatigued. The whole thing seemed less heroic and more like a scene from some farce. She was paddling a prop boat, comically dipping her oar on one side and then on the other, frantically and ceaseless, making no headway along the silken scrim. Above where the sun would eventually rise, a few decorative clouds slipped tentatively past, sleek, long, thin, and dark purple, unlike London clouds. The air itself was somehow lightening, glowing a sort of pale green. Was time finally passing? Was she actually making headway? I had no idea what the heck happened there. I can say actually? Wow. At first, Wendy thought she was hallucinating, delirious with exhaustion. but the shoreline did seem a little closer. When she let herself turn around once or twice in fear, straining her neck, the pirate ship, too, seemed a little farther away. Oh, excuse me. After a time, Wendy looked down and saw that the sea was only a couple of feet deep and as clear as drinking water, despite 1,000 different ingrained rules telling her no. Don't get your feet wet, you will catch a cold. Don't ruin your skirts in the salt water. Don't get your clothes wet also, because they will become see-through. Our hero was fed up with the boat. She slipped her boots off and tied their laces around her neck. She carefully undid her stockings and did the same with these. Then, holding up her skirts, she stepped out into the water. It wasn't cold at all. She felt like an idiot standing there in such a lovely current, skirts raised like some sort of fainting milksop from a terrible operetta. So she let them drop and strode to shore, pushing against the water. Little fish she couldn't quite see scooted out of her path. The sun pushed its way through the purple clouds, and as light grew on the beach strangely, organically, starting out weak and white, and then ripening strong and yellow. Wendy cast a final glance back. The ship and she, the only two tall things in an endless flat plain of water and shore, seemed to regard each other in wonder. Then she turned from it and stepped onto land. The dry rattle of coconut palms swaying in the distance filled the air when the sound of the ocean began to recede. Wendy had arrived in Neverland. Da-da, da-da-da. Okay, Wendy has finally made it into Neverland, and I have to readjust again. Oh my god, my legs. Okay, don't knock it over. Don't knock it. Okay, let me go back really quick. I think I said this was chapter 8. Yeah, so this was chapter 8. I guess that's chapter 9, technically. So, this is chapter 8. So, we're moving on to chapter 9. I know I said I'll do chapters 7 through 10. But it's actually going to be 9. So, here's chapter 9. Neverland. The beach sand was crunchy and perfectly golden, like, like a winter Londoner's wildest imagination. Wendy walked inland, watching her feet, her toes curling and spreading into the sensual granules. Halfway to where the shore met the jungle was a perfectly picturesque shipwreck. She clambered up it, holding onto the helpfully curvy trunk of a palm tree for balance. With a hand to her forehead, Wendy surveyed her new kingdom. She was perched at what was obviously the edge of a cove, Pegleg Point, just to the south and west of her. Despite its scurrilous reputation, the place looked downright pleasant. Tiny waves of sparkling aquamarine lapped at the edges, and were probably delightful to splash in. Out of sight, to the northeast lay Mermaid Lagoon. Off the shore beyond that would be the nefarious Skull Rock, riddled with caves where pirates hid their loot. Emptying into the cove was Crocodile Creek, a wide, sparkling rivulet whose source was somewhere in the Black Dragon Mountains. Michael had named them. These were a wild range in the center of the island that grew bleaker and spikier to the northern or Hyperborean shore. John had named that. While the closer peaks were green and clear, the further ones were gray and shrouded in mist and mystery. And if one followed Crocodile Creek towards these mountains through the pernicious forest and quiescent jungle, both John's touches, one eventually came to the Hangman's Tree, hideout for the Lost Boys. But in the very northernmost part of the island, there was... Wendy frowned. She couldn't remember, or she had never described it, or had never dreamed it. Or maybe she had, and then she had forgotten it. There was something there, but it was like it was wiped from her memory completely. Or maybe the reverse. Maybe it was unimagined yet, and therefore unexplored. The sun was brilliantly lemon yellow, the sky a bracing blue. The sea wind whipped Wendy's hair into a obliging jig. Her adventure was beginning, her quest to find Peter Pan and save Neverland. But truth be told, while she was living the adventure, it didn't feel like one. It felt horrible, not at all like the story she made up. Neverland wasn't supposed to be actually dangerous. Neverland wasn't supposed to have murderous grown-ups in it. Pirates shooting each other seemingly awfully funny in the context of a bedtime tale. But the blood on the deck had been thick and ugly, and she could still hear the way his head had hit the planks. Pirates attacking ladies had never been part of her story, and neither was laundry. "And that poor pirate," she whispered. "Zane, what was his story? I didn't make it up. What did he mean he was trapped?" Neverland was not as simple or as innocent as it had seemed. Wendy would have to stay on her toes whilst there, and everything looked just as bright and sunny and perfect as ever. Her shadow was as black and strong against the sand as a child's drawing, and... Wait, was a shadow crossing her arms? Wendy looked at her own arms, which were at first at her sides, and snapped to her chest in surprise. Her shadow still kept her arms crossed, and was now shaking her head as if chastised. Then she flexed her hand and curled it into a menacing hook. Shadow puppets without the puppets. There was no doubt at all what she was trying to say. She was upset with what Wendy had done, selling Peter's shadow. Of course, Shadow Wendy was worried about shattered Peter Pan. Here she was simply free to express it. "He didn't want his shadow," Wendy muttered to herself, in her shadow for the 1000th time. She didn't believe it. She still didn't believe it. Wendy took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. Whatever it was, she had already dealt with some of the results of her actions, and would now see to righting the additional wrongs she had created as a result. She would go find Peter. She would save Neverland. And if he was angry with her for what she had done, well, she would deal with it and accept it as fair punishment for her actions. She hopped off the shipwreck and wandered toward the greenery at the edge of the cove, trying not to notice or hope that her shadow was coming along and behaving, trying to keep her eyes on the jungle ahead. A strange structure untangled itself out of the background like a hallucination. Oh, excuse me. not part of the natural landscape. It was a funny shaped, almost spherical green pod like thing woven from living branches of trees and vines. A trellis of flowers hung down over the opening that served as a door. Wendy was so delighted, tears sprang to her eyes. It was her imaginary house. They all had them. Michael wanted his to be a ship with views of the sea. Michael John had wanted to live in a nomad on the steppes. And Wendy had wanted something that was part of the natural world itself. She tentatively stepped forward, almost swooning at the heavy scent of the door flowers. Luxuriously lighting them were a few sitterflies, silver and almost perfectly translucent in the glittery sunlight. Their sharp wings made little snickety noises as they fluttered off. Her shadow made a few half-hearted attempts to drag back, pointing to the jungle. But Wendy ignored her, stepping into the hut. She was immediately knocked over by a mad, barking thing that leapt at her from the darkness of the shelter. "Luna!" Wendy cried in joy. The wolf pup, which she had rescued in one of her earliest stories, stood triumphantly on her chest, drooling physical, very stinky dog spit onto her face. "Oh, Luna, you're real!" Wendy hugged the gray and white pup as tightly as she could, and it didn't let out a single protest yelp. "Although you're a bit bigger than I imagined," Wendy said thoughtfully, sitting up. "I thought you were a puppy." Indeed, the wolf was approaching formidable size, although she was obviously not yet quite full grown, and still had large puppy paws. She was at least 4 stone, and her coat was thick and fluffy. Yet she pranced back and forth like a child, not circling with the sly lope Wendy imagined adult wolves used. "You're not a stupid little lapdog, are you?" Wendy whispered, nuzzling her face into the wolf's fur. Luna chuffed happily and gave her a big, wet, sloppy lick across the cheek. "Let's see what's inside the house." As the cool interior embraced her, she felt a strange shudder of relief, and welcome was the only way she could describe it. She was home. The interior was small and cozy. Plated sweet-smelling brush mats softened the floor. The rounded walls made shelves difficult, so macrame ropes hung from the ceiling, cradling half logs or flat stones that displayed pretty pebbles, several beautiful eggs, and what looked like a teacup made from a coconut. A lantern assembled from translucent pearly shells sat atop a real cherry writing desk, intricately carved and entirely out of place with the rest of the interior. Wendy picked up one of the pretty pebbles in wonder, turning it this way and that before putting it in her pocket. "This is me," she breathed. She had never been there before, but it felt so secure, so right, that it couldn't have been anything but her home. Her real home. Here there was no slight tension of her back as she waited for footsteps to intrude, for reality to wake her up from her dreams. There was nothing here to remind her of previous days, sad or happy ones. There were no windows looking out at the grey world of London. There was just peace, and the scent of the mats, and the quiet droning of insects and waves outside. Neverland is a mishmash of us, of me, she said slowly. It's what we imagined and dreamed of, including the dreams we can't quite remember. Then I thought, Zane was right. It is an island that knows me better than I know myself. She could easily envision herself falling asleep on the scented mats. Adventuring was exhausting work, but she went back outside instead. Luna leapt beside her. In the bright sunlight, her shadow reappeared, jumping and waving her arms, trying to pull herself away from Wendy again. We are going after Peter Pan. I promised. I promised. We'll certainly need him against Hook and whatever he has planned. But I really don't know where to even begin looking for him. I suppose we'll just start in that direction. And with that, she strode resolutely ahead, Luna leaping beside her. If she had snuck a look, she might have seen her shadow wag her head back and forth as if making fun of her, then snapping back to aping her mistress' movements, if a little slower and more reluctantly than they were actually performed. Large-leafed plants at the edge of the jungle reflected the sun rather than soaking it up, their dark green surfaces sparkling white in the sunlight. Some of the smaller ones had literally low-hanging fruit, like jewels from a fairy tale. Behind them was an extremely inviting path into the jungle, with giant white shells for stepping stones, and rather than the muggy, disease-filled forest of books that seemed to kill so many explorers, here the air was cool and pleasant and not too moist, although Wendy could hear the distant tinkle of water splashing from a height. Oh, it's like the Tonga Springs, or Diamond Falls, Wendy wondered breathlessly. Luna, let's go see. She made herself not race ahead down the path, but moved at a leisurely, measured pace, like an adventuress, sure of herself but wary of her surroundings. And yet, as she wouldn't realize until later, she hadn't thought to grab her stockings or shoes. Those got left in her hut without even a simple goodbye. Everywhere she looked, Wendy found another wonder of Neverland, from the slow caramel snails to the gently nodding halves of the fritillary lilies. She smiled, imagining John as he peered over his glasses and the snail faded away into the background in fear, or Michael getting his nose covered in honey-scented lily pollen as he enthusiastically sniffed at the pretty flowers. The path continued, winding around a boulder into a delightful little clearing, sandy but padded here and there with tufts of emerald green grass and clumps of purple orchids. It was like a desert island version of a perfect English meadow. Oh, Luna, isn't it beautiful? Let's go see. With a loud snap of a horse rider's crop, a white vine whipped out across the path at her ankles. Ah! She cried, stumbling forward, but she didn't fall. Another vine shot out across her chest. She bounced jarringly into it and then off it. This one, too, was ugly and poisonous white, but also slightly sticky. Her dress got caught, and so did her throat, already bruised from the impact. Another vine whipped behind her so she couldn't fall backward, couldn't escape. What the deuce? She cried, pulling at the vines. They were tough but stretchy and gave rather than broke under her hands. More of them, slowly now, like they had all the time in the world, coiled around her wrists and ankles. The vicious sap itched and burned where she struggled, and it was an unhealthy scarlet color. No grown-ups allowed. Out of the clearing stepped the speaker of these words, a strange little fellow indeed. He was short and fat, and as clear and crystalline as a blob of molten glass. His head was a misshapen oval on top of his body. A peaked crystal hat sat on his head, and he held a sharp shard of a spear. The only color on him was in his eyes, strange and tan, like two butterscotch candies pressed into the surface of a snowman. What? Wendy asked indignantly, trying to understand the harsh words of the otherwise almost adorable figurine. No grown-ups allowed. He turned to face her, but not like a normal person, more like a cross between an owl and some sort of hideous broken toy. His body didn't move. Instead, his head spun smoothly and slowly and further than it should have until his pupilless eyes locked into hers. Probably it was hard to tell what he was looking at. I am not a grown-up, Minnie sputtered. Let me through. You are 16, the guard said tonelessly. The time of parties and balls and weddings and husbands has commenced. It has not commenced, Wendy said with great dignity. I am here in Neverland, aren't I? The creature's button eyes didn't move at all, but somehow darkened. You should not be here in Neverland. No grown-ups in Neverland. No fun killers. No bringers of pain and boredom. Get out. Wendy blinked at the ferocity of the ridiculous, strangely terrifying little thing. It leaned forward, bringing the tip of its spear perilously close to her stomach. Where on earth had it come from? She had never invented any such a monster. True, adults didn't figure in her stories of Neverland, except as incidental characters, pirates and their ilk, villains and foils. Neverland was supposed to be an island of endless fun for children like her and Michael and John. But she had never said anything specifically about prohibiting grown-ups or threatening them with spears. You make the days long. You make the food terrible. You make us go to school. Wendy caught her breath in shock, recognizing the tirade. Michael. Michael had horrifyingly once told his own father that he hated him, actually hated him, for making him go to school where the seats were hard and the lessons worse, and for forcing him to eat their mashed peas. Also, now that she thought about it, the shape of the little creature wasn't unlike something Michael had made out of mud once. Puppin, he had called it. Yes, this whole scenario felt a bit like Michael, now that she thought about it. A crazed, all-powerful Michael. Now you listen to me, Wendy began in her most adult voice, as if she was speaking to Michael. Bad choice. No more listening, the thing screeched madly, pushing itself as high and far into Wendy's face as it could. You go away now, forever, to Forever Place. It reached back its arm to hurl the little sphere, but Luna had had enough. She threw herself at the horrid thing. Her claws made light tinging noises as they scraped harmlessly against the crystalline surface. Her teeth slipped from the creature's neck, unable to get a good hold or sink into real flesh. While the creature was distracted by this, Wendy took the opportunity to free herself. She rocked back and forth as hard as she could against the vise, pushing her arms and legs as far as they would go. The tendrils gave just enough for her to be able to slip her right hand out. She immediately reached into her pocket and grabbed the stone she had taken from her hut. summoning as much boy-chucking rocks in a fountain as she could. Wendy hurled it at full force at the creature's bulbous, crystalline stomach. There was a satisfying crack. As soon as the tip of the rock hit its skin, giant, ragged cracks appeared from the impact point. These rapidly winnowing out throughout the rest of its body, growing like Jack Frost on a window pane, but much, much faster. The thing's mouth hung open, and it dropped its spear. As the fracture spread, it waved its arms back and forth helplessly, like a puppet or a wind-up toy. When the cracks reached its head and became so numerous that its body was almost opaque, the thing exploded. Its glittering bits hurled itself every which way through the dappled sunlight, in a beautiful wave of tinkles and pings one might expect to hear from the baby angels playing harps. Wendy flinched and covered her face. Where a shard hit her skin, it immediately melted, running down to the ground with little droplets of her own blood. "Well," she said uncertainly. Luna jumped back and forth over the thing's rapidly disappearing body, barking last warnings in triumph. "Goodness," Wendy added. She let herself experience one more moment of shock, then forced herself to focus and work at pulling away the vines. They were unpleasant to touch, and sticky and itchy. Actually not that hard to wrestle out of now that she had one hand free and no distractions. In fact, they were strangely like a pair of her mother's hose. The three children had once gotten into massive amounts of trouble for using to tie up Michael when he was kidnapped by pirates. Same color even. Wendy said thoughtfully, then a little nervously. "I suppose that's the last of them?" Luna barked, and it sounded like an affirmative response, but Wendy couldn't be certain. "I think it was really going to kill me," Wendy muttered, putting her hand out. The wolf immediately came over and leaned against her friend, sensing her need. "Isn't it funny?" There were a lot of thoughts in Wendy's head, and none of them were actually funny at all. They weren't even clear or formed thoughts, just a mishmash of feelings, misgivings, and the unnamed, fetal beginnings of ideas. Not a situation she was used to, possessing a quiet mess of genesis with no articulation, no pronouncements or forms or decisions came readily to her tongue. "Isn't it funny?" she tried again. "I thought Captain Hook would be the only real villain here. I mean, the only one I would bump into because of the shadow. And here I have run into a villain I didn't even know existed. One my brother invented as some sort of protector or savior. One... It's not really clear what that thing was, is it? But all of my stories were perfectly clear and straightforward." She looked around at the trees and the foliage, the sky and the ground. Things she had brushed by in quick descriptive phrases to the boys. Desert island, tropical plants, venomous but beautiful insects, were solid in more detail than she could have ever imagined, down to the tiny veins on the leaves. Apparently, Neverland got worked on when she wasn't even talking to the boys. They imagined things on their own, or at least Michael did. To a little child, the idea of no grown-ups allowed, to the point of death, might seem reasonable, funny even. Time passed for the three siblings in London, but it didn't in Neverland. Michael's whims and fancies remained the same here while he grew up in London, and these whims, seen through older eyes, were not harmless. They were diabolical. Neverland isn't just a simple place of childhood dreams, because childhood dreams are actually never simple. Oh, I do wish I could write that down in my little notebook. Her face suddenly constricted into a cartoonish expression of terror as she recalled a younger John furious at the Shebo twins, who had tweaked his cheek and giggled at his hat and glasses. Girls shouldn't be allowed to talk at all, he had growled at her. To boys, anyhow. How had the rest of the conversation gone? Had he made an exception for his sister? Had Wendy laughed and remonstrated him? More to the point, was this some sort of horrible punishment zone for girls in Neverland, devised by the fiendishly clever but undeveloped mind of a pre-adolescent John? Luna was watching with giant, unblinking yellow eyes as Wendy worked out all the things, far more patient than anyone had ever known. We must be on our guard, she said, kissing the wolf on her nose. This place is tricky, far trickier than I've ever dreamed. The dangers, I expect, are not the only dangers. Who knows what other horrors my little brothers dreamed up? Then again, if Neverland were as simple as my own childish fantasies, it would be no fun at all. Toffee trees and mazes easily solvable by a simple application of left, left, right, left. Where's the challenge in that? I am 16 now. Whether or not I'm an adult, I should expect more. Wendy dusted off her dress. The sun has moved slightly in the sky. Ideas and creatures might be eternal in Neverland, but still night came. Time still existed. Decisions had to be made. Luna pranced back and forth in front of her, yellow eyes gleaming with excitement, ready to go. But where to? The Mermaid Lagoon, obviously. Peter Pan often visited the mermaids in her stories. Maybe she would find him there, or get help from the friendly locals. But also, mermaids. They would be very helpful in a maritime war waged against apocalyptic pirates. And maybe, along the way, Wendy could look for fairies. They were powerful little Disneys of Neverland, weren't they? Surely they could use some magic or something against Hook. Plus, fairies. And what about the Lost Boys by Hangman's Tree? Maybe she could find them first. They would know where Peter was, and they would be terribly useful. How many stories she had written about their battles with the pirates, and how lovely it would be to have a visit too. All of those clever things Wendy had invented for them, like the slides down to the hideout from hollow trees. How marvelous to see it in person, to understand how Neverland had worked out the details. Maybe Peter would even be there already. She gulped she gulped a little at the thought. Or maybe the Lost Boys later. Really, the best thing was to round up an army to defend Neverland, wasn't it? She could find Peter and apologize to him, and bring him up to speed on Hook's nefarious plot later. Yes, mermaids first. They may be fairies. I wonder where we should go find them. And the question was answered. In true Neverland fashion, was a fairy as a fairy dove head first into Wendy's chest. Okay, that is the end of that. We'll pick up back on with chapter 10 next time. So, that is also something else that's different. So Wendy finally made it onto Neverland land with the help of a pirate from Captain Hook's crew. He helped her sneak out. Wendy found her imaginary house in Neverland, which awesome. Something different in this book than from any other story or telling of Peter Pan is that Wendy's shadow is active like Peter Pan's shadow. Also, Wendy has a pet wolf, which I'm not hating. It's a pet wolf. It's a wolf. I'm not gonna hate on that. Another thing that was kind of different was that um, I always had the idea that Neverland was already its own place and that Wendy was just having dreams of it, imagining that she was there until she actually got there. Not that their dreams could actually influence the place. So the fact that Michael had imagined a little crystalline thing to make sure that no adults get into Neverland or bother the flow of Neverland and things like that. That actually sounds crazy to me. But anyway, like I said, that is the end of that. We will start up again with chapter 10 to chapter 12. Um, Next time, I'm not gonna say tomorrow because I do not actually know. Anyway, you all have a good night, good morning, whatever you were listening, whatever time you were listening to this to, and stay dreaming, I guess. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. But keep the fantasy real and keep your mind imaginative. Toodaloo. Goodbye.